So in this video series where I'm talking through the automation steps that I've produced for the generous company and in regards to the automated sales pipeline that I've produced, I'm going to talk about how do I identify areas that are ripe for automation. Now, this is relatively more of like the softer side of this, but I would argue that this is by far the most important part of the automation process. A lot of the time, people can make their own automations, but it's being able to identify what is the right fruit to be picked and how can you reform process as a whole and implement that process in a way that is sticky and people are actually going to adhere to that is the crux of what you're trying to do as someone who automates businesses. At least who comes into businesses and then automates them rather than building businesses from automation up. So the key thing, the key first step, what I do with all clients is information gathering. And this is kind of fairly obvious, but basically you want to build a reference of the business. What does the business do to begin with? And what are the critical rate limiting steps in the business, which is slowing down, say, the revenue or whatever they're trying to achieve in their North Star? A lot of the time that is going to be some kind of revenue-based activity or even profit. So yeah, the first step is build a top-down picture of the business. This can be like an organogram if it's a fairly large organization, or just written documentation. I normally just throw something on FigJam or even Miro, just so I know who's who and what they do and what the general areas of the business. Then we need to identify areas of the business. So what is product, operations, internal, advisory, etc., all these different standard business areas. And you've got to understand like how these interact and what are the rate limiting steps between them as well. And one of the key steps here is actually how effectively does information pass between those areas. So a particular business area might be particularly efficient, but it might not be inefficient. It might be inefficient with respect to the other areas. They might not be working synergically together. And then you want to be looking at documentation. If there is documentation for a business, you want to review that and see if it actually aligns with what you found out from your own sort of bottom-up investigation. Then two is analysis. You want to figure out what is a healthy process and an unhealthy process. A lot of the time I try and interview people. Sometimes they can't make the call, so I ask them to record some footage or even respond to a sort of questionnaire. I prefer videos and doing it in person because it's a lot easier and a lot more human-to-human interactions. You can really learn a lot more. But yeah, you got to figure out what people like doing. Just be human about it. Ask them what they like, what they don't like, what's good, what's bad, and just ask those kind of questions that you wouldn't normally have within a survey or like a less hands-off approach. And then from that, investigate the current processes. So you just want to collect all this information that you've already gathered in phase one and then in phase two to really build this clear picture of what's happening. And then final phase is, of course, the execution, the prioritization, and then the aftercare. So I love to use the Moscow framework to prioritize my work. So that's the must-have, should have, could have, won't have. You start with the must-haves, and then you must-have tasks, and then you do the should-have tasks, and then you should definitely question the could-haves. And a lot of the time when I get to those, they're relatively irrelevant now, having come back to them after a little time. But sometimes they can be reprioritized to should-haves and won't-haves, of course. Any of those tasks don't do them. And then next step is behavioral-based investigation. So you might have executed on some of these reforms and processes, and you've implemented changes to process. But a lot of the time, it's quite tricky for organizations that are very established to change the way that they work. And so I like to use this framework called COM-B. I won't go through it in this video, but I really recommend looking into that if you're struggling to change process organically within a business. It's got a lot of evidence behind it that really helps with behavioral-based changes. And then, of course, execution. That we prioritize with the Moscow framework. And that's as simple as that. So from a top-down perspective, it's understand the business, find where people are communicating inefficiently, what they like doing, what they don't like doing, then prioritize it with Moscow, implement it with respect to the COM-B framework, and execute it and ensure that you are providing that aftercare and that documentation that you need to fully hand over automated processes and also changed and optimized processes to the end client.